Month, and we are here for our very first event for kicking off the month, Black Philanthropy Month. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Kia Jarmon, co-chair of Give Black, Give Back, alongside of Lisa Swift Young, also my co-chair, and Antonio Young, who's on our advisory committee. Off the air, who you don't see, is Audra Cox, who many of you all have communicated with at some point or spoken with at some point, and she is our wonderful staff liaison at the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. So Black Philanthropy Month is an opportunity, an entire month dedicated to highlighting the $11 billion of annual giving that Black philanthropists already give. I always say Lisa is our statistician, so she's the one who will make sure that our numbers are correct. But we absolutely know that that's just the trackable income of a treasure that Black people give all the time. They're also time, talent, and testimony, which is some of what we're going to talk about today that we want to highlight. A little bit more about Give Black, Give Back. We are about 2 years in the making, really making sure that we amplify the Black philanthropy in Nashville, in Middle Tennessee, and making sure that you're aware of the many Black-led, Black-initiated funds that are housed right at the Community Foundation. We also serve to support the many Black-led nonprofits and organizations that work to support Black individuals in our community. And then, of course, we're here to make sure we share stories and provide education around the economic wealth gap and what opportunities or resources there are to lessen that for the Black community. So make sure that you go to blackgivingback.com to learn more about our entire month of National Black Philanthropy Month. We have some really special and amazing opportunities coming up this month. So before we jump in, I want to make sure that I introduce our wonderful other face that you see on the screen today that many of you all are probably very familiar with. If not, you may even follow his Instagram account, which I do, the Nashville I Wish I Knew. David Ewing is a 9th generation, I believe, Nashvillian. He is an attorney and historian, and he's really been key and instrumental in making sure that we keep the history alive, particularly around Black communities here in our city. So David, thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
I'm great, Kia, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for all the work that you're doing at the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee, which is one of my favorite organizations here.
Absolutely. Well, as you see, I'm in the car at an event that at some point you will be joining. So I'm going to be jumping off. But before I do, I always want to start with the question around, kind of give a little more information about who you are, your family legacy, and then what is your philanthropy story? So what is the first memory you have of philanthropy? After, just as an FYI, after David speaks, then you may not see me, but you will see Lisa and Antonio, and they will take it over from there. One last nugget, because Kelly Wahlberg, who's behind the scenes from Community Foundation, would get me if I didn't say this. Please make sure that you like, share, and comment. We'll be answering questions along the way as well. So David, take it away.
Thank you, Kia. My family story involves Nashville, and it has involved Nashville, my family, since 1779. I'm a 9th generation Nashvillian, as you said, and the Ewing family is the oldest Black family in Nashville. We've been here since the early days of James Robertson and John Donaldson, of course, enslaved during that period, also enslaved out at the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home, enslaved at Travelers Rest, John Overton's home. But it was really because of post-Civil War that some of the same families that once enslaved my family sent them to Fisk University, that we are kind of where we are today. And it's interesting, you cannot have a conversation about Black philanthropy without talking about our HBCUs, particularly here in town: Fisk University, Meharry, Tennessee State, and American Baptist, and we'll talk about them later too. But my family story also weaves through all of those kind of HBCUs. My mother came to Nashville from small town Alabama, Tuskegee, home of another famous 19th century Black philanthropist, Booker T. Washington, who probably defined what Black philanthropy was right after the Civil War, with all the money that he raised going across the country, particularly up the Northeast, to raise money from white foundations and white people to educate Black people in the South. But my mother grew up in Tuskegee and attended Fisk University. My father attended Meharry Medical College, it's where they met here in Nashville. And so my story, my grandfather was a teacher at Pearl High School and also a minister. So charity starts at home, as we always say, and Black philanthropy always starts in the kind of areas of town. So I grew up in Bordeaux and North Nashville. And so my first kind of memory of Black philanthropy was probably in the pews of First Baptist Church, the old First Baptist Church, the one that Martin Luther King spoke in, the one that John Lewis and Diane Nash were trained in the basement. Reverend Kelly Miller Smith Sr., who baptized me, he always had a sermon of the day, but his message was always to help out the communities and support our growing activists here in town. And there was always still some work to be done. And so he not only challenged us spiritually, but he challenged us to get involved with our time and our money, because that's what people of what Du Bois would later call the talented 10th, who attended First Baptist Church, the educated, the ones that were involved in the community, that was their purpose. They had to kind of give back because they didn't get there by themselves. And these Black organizations, these Black institutions, whether it be the NAACP, many of the colleges and schools, our churches, those were the foundations that we all stood on. And so, and of course, seeing the old wooden collection plate pass and having, my mother kind of slipped me $1 to put in there. I think that in the Black community, that's a lot of people's first kind of experience of giving money, that literally your parents give you money and you're supposed to put it in the plate. And you kind of understand that that's a part of building community. And that's what people do. You just don't keep your money yourself and you don't spend it on yourself. You give it to others. And we are all taught that at an early age. So those were some of my first stories. And you talk about philanthropy, we're talking about the Community Foundation. And I have to mention one of my favorite Nashvillians of all time, who's no longer with us, Francis Guest, longtime board member and fan of the Community Foundation. Francis was the embodiment of Black philanthropy. He mentored us all. He told us why it was important. He told us why it was still needed, and that, African-American based charities need the same help and support. And we also need to be at the table for boards and commissions too. Francis and I would often joke who was on the most amount of boards at any given time. He usually had one or two over me, but they were a lot. And that was part of the duty of being a civic Nashvillian, that not-for-profit work was almost just as important as your regular job. And that was how you use your expertise in giving back and things like that. And I must say, after I graduated Vanderbilt Law School, I ended up being a part of the Young Leaders Council. And the Young Leaders Council, which is still around today, and I was later chair of that board, it is for people aged 25 to 39 to train them to be on not-for-profit boards and kind of teach them the roles of the philanthropy in Nashville. Fundraising was a very big part of the training that we got and how important it was. And probably the most important thing that the Young Leaders Council did for me was after you go through the class for a year, you're supposed to get a board to intern on. And I was able to get an internship on the Middle Tennessee chapter of the American Red Cross. And that was kind of my first of many not-for-profit boards that I would later be on here in Nashville. I think almost 40 if you count back that long.
That's a great story. It sounds like you and your family have sort of also, I know you mentioned Francis Guest and sort of his contribution and his family has to the Nashville community, but you guys are definitely up there. You took his lessons well, and I'm sure he'd be super proud of all that you're doing and continuing in his legacy and as well as building your own legacy specifically. So very good story. So if anybody out there has not done the research and found all that. Hopefully this is going to be, and forgive me if this is already existing, but there is a book hopefully coming soon, maybe.
Yes, very.
so at some point that story needs to be captured. That's what we're trying to do here at the Community Foundation, is capture these stories. So I hope that your family does, take to heart that maybe is a book sometime, because that story needs to be shared. So I know you mentioned your first time giving, as far as your parents giving you money. I think we all can relate to that conversation of you get the dollar and you pass it down. But as an adult, what would be one time in particular? You were recently quoted in an article for USA Today and the Washington Post talking about the significance of giving and the relevance of giving specifically in the Black community. When can you give me like the first time that you gave of your own and sort of did that piece? What was that like, and what organization was that to?
There were many things that I did in high school and college, but the thing that probably stands out the most in my kind of giving history is the work that I did with the Red Cross. We, as I said, I was on the Young Leaders Council. I was an intern at the Red Cross, and they asked me to be on the regular board after my year was up, and I was very pleased to do that. And the United Way had just changed their funding formula, and we had basically gone from getting over $1 million a year to about half of that. And we were really struggling to kind of keep money coming in because the Red Cross at the time did not have active fundraising. We just let the United Way fund us. And the tornado hit in '98. And after the tornado hit, we had gone to Ambassador Joe Rogers, the former ambassador to France under Ronald Reagan, to try to get him to lead a capital campaign, which he was too busy at the time. But he had told us if there was ever a big disaster, he'd be ready. And he was a man of his word. And I was on the board at the time, and I remember spending a week at that Charlotte office of the Red Cross with Joe Rogers after the tornado hit. Our building had a hole in it, literally. The tornado, Red Cross is the organization supposed to help people out in disaster. We had our own disaster with that building on Charlotte. And we spent an entire week in a conference room dialing for dollars. This was before GoFundMe. This was before a lot of other tools that people use during natural disasters or quick disasters to get money. And what I learned during that time of giving was this was a community effort. Although the business community responded very generously, as they normally do here in Nashville, we wanted everyone's money. We wanted everyone's nickels and dimes and dollars, and we wanted to feel that we were raising money throughout the whole community. And I remember at the time, we were trying to line up every single bank in town to give at least some donation, and we did that. And I think it was the first time in modern Nashville history that every bank had kind of participated in a fund like that. But I remember we were concerned at the time that there were people in the streets of Nashville with buckets saying that they were collecting for the tornado victims of the Red Cross, but they weren't. And we wanted a safe and secure way to people to give. And like I said, this was well before GoFundMe. And so when you see a disaster on the news, you often see give money to Regions Bank if you want to help this family, or give money to Pinnacle if you want to help this family. But the first time, we had lined up every single bank in Nashville. So if you had gone after the tornado and given some money and presented it at a bank, we would get it. And I thought that was collaboration, and giving is also collaboration. And one of the things that I really learned spending literally a week with Joe Rogers is that everyone needs to feel like they can give. And we cared about those small gifts too. We cared about, we wanted the community to heal, and there were people that were hurting and they needed money now. And the Red Cross, the national chapter, loans you money, and they hope that these local communities pay them back. If it's a small town and a tornado hits, they never get to pay that back. They don't have the resources. So it's up to a city like Nashville that we could raise them. They'll learn us the $1.2 million. But in literally a week with Joe Rogers, we raised that back. The first day we raised over $500,000. And I just felt like the power of philanthropy and just asking money to help. One of the great things about Black philanthropy is taking care of organizations that might get ignored. And if you ask for money, particularly amongst your influence, you might have somebody that's influential that has resources, but they don't know about this organization. This organization can really benefit from that help. Or you might get someone involved in it just because they were involved once, that they're a future board member, or they're a longtime giver to that organization. So to me, we always respond well during disasters, but that one disaster, learning from one of our greatest fundraisers back then, political, religious, or not-for-profit, Ambassador Joe Rogers, was a better lesson that I probably got from going through any other leadership class that I've been through, and I still think about it today.
Thanks for sharing. Tanya, do you have a follow-up question?
Well, not really a follow-up question, but again, thank you for being a big part of that movement to help kind of institutionalize that and really bring it to the forefront, especially here in Nashville. And just curious about, you had mentioned about the prominence of Fisk and the HBCUs in the area. Just curious about the history of Black Nashvillians as far as in philanthropy itself. Just curious on what's your take on that.
So after the Civil War here in Nashville, we had many Black institutions start, colleges, churches, and other charitable organizations. One of my favorite kind of stories related to Black philanthropy involves my church, First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill. It was started, a mission of the church was started in 1848 when they were given an enslaved person by the name of Nelson Mary. And as opposed to just selling this enslaved person like a lot of people sadly did here in Nashville, they decided that they were going to educate him. He became the sexton, which is like a janitor of the church, and they made him a minister. They baptized him, and he was the first Black Baptist minister in town. And they gave him a part of the church, which is the Black mission of the church, that they met in the balcony. There were some freed African Americans at the time. When the Civil War broke out and when 1862 came, Nashville was an occupied city by the Union Army, and the Confederates either fled or were arrested. And so Nelson Mary and the African Americans ran First Baptist Church during the Civil War. There weren't the white congregants around. And they got used to that. They did it well. They kept the church open. They kept the building, intact during the Civil War. And when the white congregations showed back up after the Civil War was over, it's kind of like that scene from Alexander Hamilton when Thomas Jefferson comes back and says, "What did I miss?" And just kind of expects everything to go back to the way it was. And they liked their freedom from having a mission and in the balcony, and they did not have the resources at the time. And so the white First Baptist Church raised $70,000 to start First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill, and build a building on 8th Avenue. And that, I think, was a lesson that my church has always kind of been grateful for, and it's the power of money. And one of the things about Black philanthropy, and we all go to events and we all have things like that, but smart philanthropy, and the Community Foundation is a perfect example. Kia mentioned that there's all sorts of funds that will outlive us all, that will be around 100 years from now and 200 years from now. Real smart philanthropy is the long game. It looks at the institutions that serve people, and the people that sent my great-great-grandfather to Fisk University, Prince Albert, right after the Civil War, they were probably just looking at helping him. But by helping him, they helped me and every other member of my family. We wouldn't be where we were today if it weren't for his getting an education and him becoming the first Black lawyer in Nashville and all the other things that he did. So the power of money given in the proper institutions can not only improve our lives or other people's lives today, it can improve generations of lives. So when you think about helping someone out at a charity like Renewal House, and you get someone on their feet, you're helping their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. And so the long game is very important to kind of look at that. One of the great philanthropy stories too, and kindness can be infectious and kindness can spread generosity. So the story of Meharry Medical College is one of one of my most favorite kind of philanthropy stories. You had a group of brothers that were going through Ohio around the time of the Civil War, and their wagon got stuck in a mud bog, and it was late at night, and they knocked on the door. They were in a kind of poor African-American neighborhood, and the people there said, can you help us get our wagon out? And they said, well, we can't tonight, it's dark and we need more people, but why don't you stay with us overnight? And they did, and the next day they got the neighbors and family members, and they freed this wagon, which was stuck and really could not have been freed by the brothers themselves. The brothers were very grateful, but they didn't have any money themselves. They were just really kind of hand and mouth themselves too. And what ended up happening, they said, if we ever make it, we're going to do something nice for Black people. And when they did, they remembered that. And they gave the money that started what was then the medical department at Central Tennessee College, which was named after the Meharry brothers. That is why we have Meharry Medical College today, because of the generosity of this African-American community helping out this family and then them wanting to pay it forward. That term is just very overused, but it's true. I mean, when you pay it forward, you help so many people. And the Meharry brothers could have never thought that their gift then would educate half of the Black doctors in America one day, and even today, a third of the Black dentists. And it's just because of this, meeting. And the other thing that I wrote an article for Style Blueprint about disasters recently. And this is one of my favorite stories related to the Fifth Jubilee Singers. The Fifth Jubilee Singers were started 150 years ago this year. And they were started to raise money for this fledgling university. And Fisk University needed money to keep the doors open from day one. They were not really financially stable in the early days. So the treasurer of Fisk, George White, came up with this concept to have these formerly enslaved people travel the United States back then to raise money for the school. And so the very first night that they were sent on the road, they were in the Midwest, I think in Ohio, and they had made about $70 on the gate for their concert. And these were students that didn't have a lot of money, and the school truly needed money, which is why they were sent out on the road. And what ended up happening was the Chicago fire happened that night. And the night of the Chicago fire, everyone was really sad about what happened. And the students all got together and unanimously decided they were going to give their entire proceeds of that concert to the victims of the Chicago fire. They didn't have any money themselves, but they gave everything they had to the Chicago fire, 100%. And because of that generosity, word quickly spread. We didn't have social media, we didn't have Twitter, but many newspapers wrote about it. Hey, these poor students from Nashville, they gave all their money to the Chicago fire. And then people started to invite them to concerts that they wouldn't have had in the past. And then more people attended. And that one act of generosity from the Fisk University Jubilee Singers to give money, all of their money, to the Chicago fire, put them on the map.
I had not heard that story, but it is obviously, I think all of us are at least on the line in the past have been church people. So we've heard of those stories. We've heard of stories like that. If you give and it will be given back to you, pressed down, running over. And also just those types of things out there. So that story is truly what philanthropy, Black philanthropy. So thank you so much for sharing that story, because I hope those who are listening can sort of take that story to say sometimes it's not equal giving, but it's equal sacrifice. And if you sacrifice it all, as we know in the Christian faith, is that, God will repay you in ways that you can never imagine. And so that's definitely an opportunity there. So that kind of leads to another question, is that a lot of people see philanthropy, especially in the Black community, as philanthropy is how do we balance our immediate needs, our needs for right now. There's so many issues that the Black community is dealing with as far as economically, health disparities, all those different things where it feels like, having this money for a legacy when you need it for right now. How do Black philanthropists, or how would you suggest Black philanthropists sort of balance that? The immediate needs of people that are, somebody needs to be bailed out of jail. Someone needs to be, taken care of. Someone needs to pay a hospital bill. Someone needs to, those things are urgent things. But then this long game that you talk about, how would you suggest that Black philanthropists sort of address or tackle that?
Well, you have to take care of yourself first, of course, but if you're able to take care of yourself first, you could take care of others. And, everyone, you see how much money we spend on Starbucks or just things that, if you cut back, we could find money. It's like every budget, you could probably find 10 or 15% and cut back. And so the same thing applies that, we all have resources that we spend on other things that might not be as important as, helping someone out. And that, like I said, that long game is so important, and particularly endowments and, giving to organizations that will be good stewards and that will keep the money going again and again. The people that have endowed faculty chairs, endowed family scholarships, that is a gift that will last, in perpetuity. It's just, you're going to send someone to Fisk University on a scholarship, or you're going to hire a very good professor to, teach at Tennessee State University that has an endowed scholarship. But getting back to historically speaking, another favorite story of mine happened around 1915. In the days of segregation, the YMCA of Nashville, which was a very prominent organization. If you look back before World War I, there were just a handful of kind of big Nashville nonprofits. There was the Red Cross, there was the Ladies Hermitage Association, and the United Way. Those were probably the three biggest charities in town at the time. And the YMCA, which had a very nice building in Nashville on Church Street then, was segregated. African Americans were not allowed to go into the YMCA. And so a group of Black community leaders decided to make their own YMCA, which they called the Colored YMCA at the time, and to buy an old hotel on the corner of now Martin Luther King and 4th Avenue. They needed a lot of money, and they needed money to refit it, and they needed money for programming. So within the Black community in 1915, they raised $33,000 for this colored YMCA, which was a lot of money for people to give. And because of that, it got the attention of Julius Rosenwald, who gave money all over the South for the famous Rosenwald schools. And he came to Nashville and saw what was happening here and gave another $25,000 for the colored YMCA. And the city was hopefully going to match it, which they eventually did. But it was because everybody had skin in the game and everyone saw the need. And like I said, the regular YMCA was segregated. They were not taking care of the African-American citizens of Nashville, but that did not stop these people from raising $33,000 in Nashville from Black people exclusively. The other story that I've always liked is kind of catty corner across the street from where the colored YMCA was the Morris Memorial Building. The Morris Memorial Building is a 4-story building a block away from the courthouse that opened in 1924. It was a $500,000 building. And this was the publishing arm of the National Baptist Convention. And they had one of the most sophisticated printing press of any Black organization in the world in that building. But how did they have a $500,000 to build that building? Literally, Baptist churches from all over across America gave their nickels, dimes, pennies, and dollars, and that added up to $500,000 to build the Morris Memorial Building. The Morris Memorial Building is only one of 2 African-American owned buildings in downtown Nashville. There are only 2 in the interstate loop. You think about the old Black neighborhoods near the Capitol, the old Black neighborhoods near Municipal Auditorium, where the Morris Building is today. There are only 2 buildings today in this booming city that are owned by Black organizations. They're both religious. The Morris Building owned by the National Baptist Convention, and of course my church, First Baptist Church. There are no other major buildings owned by African Americans in downtown Nashville.
That's amazing. That just definitely goes to, you're giving a lot of really great stories. And for those of you guys who, if you have friends, have them share this, listen to this. This is history that we definitely need to make sure that everyone knows, and the pride that goes with that. I think sharing those stories and knowing that we own and we have owned and what they did with as little as they had. It also goes back to something you said earlier, is that when you give Black, you give back, right? So that's literally how the name sort of came from, that standpoint of how that you give back to a community that will actually give a return on investment for those of us in business who are always looking for a return on investment. I think, David, you're sharing a lot of returns on investment on how that actually works. So if you're looking to spend your money and give your money intentionally through philanthropy, there are 40 plus funds that are on the blackgivingback.com website. So I encourage you guys to look at those. We are in the process of endowing the Black Giving Back Fund, the Greater Fund. So to your point, David, we have taken that advice to look at that from a legacy standpoint, to say how long that, that'll go on in particular. So just thank you for that information. Antonio, do you have a follow-up question or another question for David?
Well, you had touched on that, about that philanthropy and about recirculating the dollars again within, in the Black community, and just curious on some of the history of how that's transpired over the years, as far as the how that philanthropy has, has evolved over time.
Sure. I mentioned Booker T. Washington earlier, and Booker T. Washington spent a lot of time in Nashville. He was on the board of Fisk University, which is interesting. Most people didn't know that. He met his second wife there. And although he ran Tuskegee, which would have been seen as a rival to Fisk back then, he believed in Black institutions and realized that, you can't just have one down in Alabama. There needs to be one in Nashville. There needs to be a couple in Atlanta, Hampton and Howard, and the Washington, D.C. area. And that would create this kind of basis of support. And so when Booker T. Washington came here, he also started the Nashville Negro Business League, which was entrepreneurs and people that Booker T. Washington always preached this kind of, help yourself mentality, this bootstraps mentality. And he believed that, yes, white people could help in some ways, but the African-American community needed to also help themselves. And as I said, he was very famous for going across the country, raising money from this rural school in Alabama that would educate people. And in the South, some people were off the plantation, some people were off the farms. But Booker T. Washington thought that, some people needed a formal education, some people needed a vocational education, that all the people that got educated at Tuskegee or that worked at Tuskegee, we stand on the shoulders of all the HBCUs from that period of time, because back then nobody could go to Vanderbilt, no one could go to Harvard or Princeton. You went to Hampton, you went to Howard, you went to Morehouse, you went to Meharry and Fisk and American Baptist and Tennessee State. And so those colleges created a Black middle class. And that's one thing that we don't really emphasize enough about a city like Nashville, Tennessee. We've had a Black middle class for 150 years here. After the Civil War, we had Black doctors and lawyers and business people, and it formed a very large Black middle class, of course, because of what was going on here with the HBCUs.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think, like you said, you see that nationwide, the disenfranchisement of Black communities. I know heard about, when the highway was built, just cutting Jefferson Street in half, and different things there. So just curious on, there's a rich heritage of where we've come from, but as far as the nonprofits now, what do you see as kind of a game plan to reconnect, as far as Black philanthropy and really kind of take us into the next?
Yeah. Well, that's why I like what the Give Black and Give Back is doing, because it's reaching a wider net of the people that serve, the African Americans and others that serve on these not-for-profit boards. And that's a very important role. And I agree. And, but as I always told Francis that, there's a larger number than the 12 of us that seem to be asked to be on, 90% of these African American boards here in town. But it needs to be part of our culture and our DNA. And some people, they're just new to philanthropy or what it really means and kind of how it could benefit. And everyone has their own definition of how you can help. And so we just want people to get, charity, once again, could start close to home. You could have a neighborhood organization or a church or community center or someone that you just see is doing good work in Nashville. And I think our stories, which is why I'm glad that the Community Foundation is highlighting this, our stories don't get told like the other stories. Maybe because they're in North Nashville, maybe because the dollar amount is smaller, but they're just as interesting and significant, particularly if you look at a percentage of a person's kind of wealth, that what they are doing to help out. And sometimes, as Kia said, it may be more time than money, but time is a very valuable asset too of all of us. And so being involved and just kind of carrying that mantle, I talked earlier about the Red Cross. It's easy or relatively easy to raise money after disaster. It's the day-to-day work that is most important. If we have a bombing on 2nd Avenue or another tornado or another disaster, yes, people want to be generous and they'll open up their checkbooks and they'll see it on the news and they'll feel bad about it and do it. But there's so many organizations that are just helping inner city kids on the street or troubled teens or senior citizens that are having problems with housing. Those are the organizations that we need to kind of support because they don't get as much attention, and you can make a big difference. And that's where someone's circle of influence can kind of bring attention to the organization. And if you join a not-for-profit board that maybe doesn't have that focus, you could be the person to drive and have that vision and say, we need a capital campaign, or we need to do this, or this is how we're going to serve our population better. And everyone can, it doesn't have to be on boards like the Symphony or Cheekwood or someone like that. There are all sorts of boards in Nashville that need the help.
That's super important that we sort of look at that as far as the nonprofit specifically in the community. And you pointed out something that we mentioned earlier as far as that when all this money generally comes in those situations where after disaster, as you mentioned, that statistically only about 3% of that money actually ends up in the Black community, even though maybe that's the intent. Across the board, when you look at organizations who do research, that only 3% of that actually ends up in Black communities. So working with, for those of you who are listening out there, working with a Black-led fund is extremely important to making sure that those day-to-day needs get taken care of so that money can be extended. Because if one thing we know how to do is we know how to make money go a lot longer, right? So we know how to, when we get the money, we know how to help the people that need to be helped in the short term, but also looking at that long game of actually gaining that money. So it's extremely important to look at that. How can we help encourage and support corporations here in Nashville and Tennessee to give back? Like, what would be your advice? Because you've been on these boards. So how does that look?
And I think the other thing, the corporate community, most of these big companies here in Nashville that give away hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars a year have some sort of committee or group that kind of decides where the money is allocated. And I was on such a group when I worked at Gaylord Entertainment. And what's interesting is I think a lot of these companies traditionally weren't as diverse as they should have been. Maybe these are certain executives in the company that just sat on the boards and they traditionally supported the organizations where their top executives served on the boards, and they might not support other organizations that, there are a lot of volunteers in their company that do or are very important. So I think from a charitable giving standpoint that these larger companies need to kind of look at the changing needs of the community. Nashville, everyone knows that Nashville has changed so much in the last 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and so has the needs for the not-for-profit community. So if you're a bank or a large entity that has given away money in this town for 25 or 50 years, you also need to change how you look at giving away money, because Nashville's changed so much and the needs have changed too. And where people have changed, and what people need today, maybe it's more affordable housing than job things in the past. I mean, the needs are strong, and we just need to kind of focus on them. And if you're just giving away money the same way you did 10 or 20 years ago as a company, you're not doing well.
So how do we, I guess just to follow up on that question, first of all, thank you for that piece of it as well. But also, how do we, I think African Americans, we don't have a legacy of philanthropy. Well, let me take that back. We have a legacy of philanthropy, but not in the conventional sense, in the secular sense. We're used to, the statistics say that 9 out of 10 of our dollars that we give are given to religious organizations. We give, so that's not the issue, but giving from this standpoint. So what are some lessons that either our philanthropists or Black philanthropists who have funds at the community foundation, or those who are looking to be philanthropists, like, how do we get training to make sure that we're making ourselves accessible to get those funds from some of the bigger organizations? Like, what are some tips that you think that you've learned over legacy? Because it sounds like you've been doing this, this is a family thing that's let down. Like, is there a class that we could take to say, to say, how do we engage these organizations to put ourselves in a position to be able to receive those funds? Because we know that once we have access to them, we know how to best impact our communities.
Right. And I guess another kind of early memory of philanthropy and giving is my mother and grandmother were involved with the Links International organization. And the Links is an organization, I always like to kind of call it it's like the Black version of the Junior League. It's in multiple cities all over, and it's a very important civic organization for Black women to kind of do charity work and give and help out their communities and neighborhoods. And so there are often all sorts of Links fundraisers and events that I remember my mother and grandmother organizing. And my grandmother was, I think, in charge of the Southeast chapter for a little while. And so those, I got to see not only my family, but other people kind of come together and give money and give time and have priorities. And spending summers in Tuskegee, Alabama, like I said, where Booker T. Washington established his school, you saw the community down there of older Black people that knew that, it's not only passing the money down to your family, it's passing it down to your community. And smart planning looks a little bit wider. And so you want to make sure that communities are solid and the organizations that are most important in these communities are solid too. So the legacy of Booker T. Washington, which I heard a lot of from my grandmother, of course, was to give and to be involved and to help raise money. That, people don't want to hear this necessarily in some places, but you're never done raising money. There's always a need, and always you have to keep up with everybody else. And if you're not raising money, your other kind of peers are raising money, or the people that you do, so you're behind. There's no rest for the weary, especially in this market of bigger, more buildings, more staff, more impact. And that's kind of the lesson that we need to kind of learn too. You talk about a class, but we should teach each other. Of course, some of the best training I got was from people like Francis Guest, but also serving on various not-for-profit boards and seeing their situations and doing committee work and really doing something about it.
Oh, thanks for really highlighting that. And just curious, on that same vein, you've got there are a lot of existing organizations, a lot of legacy organizations that, as you mentioned, that have existed, a number of new ones that have come up. Unfortunately, many of them, you see a lot of Black-led nonprofits, many times are understaffed, underfunded. Just didn't know, how do you see that, how we need to evolve in order to do that? Like, have better collaboration, or what are some suggestions there?
Nashville is a town of stories and storytellers. And I'm not just talking about the people that come here to be country music stars or songwriters. You have to tell your story properly. You have to tell it in a great way that basically compels people to kind of want to be involved and get excited about it. I think there's no better story in this city or country than what happened at Fisk University. For it to be established to basically train formerly enslaved people, and then this great story of the Jubilee Singers, and then the Harlem Renaissance basically coming through Fisk University with Aaron Douglas on the faculty, James Weldon Johnson on the faculty, Arna Bontemps on the faculty, and then the leaders of the civil rights movement like Diane Nash and John Lewis being at Fisk University. If you can't get someone excited about that story, I mean, we just shouldn't be here. And so I think a lot of our Black charities or smaller charities need to kind of work on their message and stories, because there's so much money and generous people here in Nashville. And I know after the murder of George Floyd, there were some people that gave money to the NAACP here in Nashville, some songwriters and some other people that they just said, hey, I'm giving to these organizations. And those are the kind of people are looking to help, and they often don't know where. And that's why your presence has to be known, because if you're not known, it's almost, you could be doing good work, but you have to rise to the occasion to kind of attract the big money and the big philanthropists, because it has kind of a cycle to it. If you get a big gift from someone in the corporate board world, that's always called a leadership gift. Somebody's like, oh, well, so-and-so gave to that organization. They must be doing good things. Let me look at that organization too. And it kind of has a spiraling effect. So it's up to all of us that are involved with smaller organizations is to really tell your story well, and to get your mission-driven people that you're helping. Maybe it's a video, maybe it's on social media. Thistle Farms does a great job of telling the story of people that Reverend Becca Stevens has kind of hired and turned their lives around and given them positive things to do. And they're always telling the stories about who they're helping and how. And there's places where people can literally go see that in person, including the Thistle Farms Cafe. Yes, and so I think it's up to all of us to not be kind of just out of sight and out of mind. If you really want to go to that next level, you've got to let people know what you're doing.
That is super amazing. I think, and the interesting thing about that, there's many platforms out there now that, as you mentioned before, when you guys were on the phone at the Red Cross making phone calls, you didn't have access to TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. You know, you had to do it by, it had to be that compassionate story over the phone. But using social media or using print media or any type of media, all to sort of tell that story. So maybe that's something that we can work on at Black Giving Back, is talk specifically about how to craft your story and to be a storyteller about your organization, so that we do have some stories. So for those of you who are interested, there are a few stories on the blackgivingback.com if you want to check those out. And we also invite you to share your story if you have a philanthropy story, whether or not you have a foundation or whether or not you have a nonprofit, that you can go to Black Giving Back and talk about your philanthropy story specifically. You know, David has, you know, hopefully he will give us the honor of putting some of his stories out there as well, because I think those stories need to be chronicled, and we need to keep those in the forefront so that we can have that legacy of giving from a time standpoint, treasure, and talents. And so I hope that you use one of your talents to be able to share some of those stories with everyone, that people know those stories. And so that's a big part of what we do as well. So, you know, as blackgivingback.com, we sort of share that information. And I want to give you time to, you know, sort of share. So first of all, thank you so much for spending time with us. And we definitely want to be not remiss in sharing what other projects you're working on that we can support you, since you've given of time. Again, going back to what we said, sometimes when you give, you get the opportunity to get as well. And so we want to honor that. And so let us know about what you're working on, what you're doing, you know, some things that you're currently involved in. And we want to make sure we support you because you've given to us.
So before I answer that part of the question, I want to give one more final example of a great new national institution, the National Museum of African American Music. The seeds of that organization were planted 20 years ago with Francis Guest again, and Dr. T.B. Boyd, and a large group of civic people. And then 20 years later, here we are. We're in the heart of downtown. We're on one of the best corners of downtown. And it's not, and you know, the board has been led by Kevin Lavender, my friend, and of course, Henry Hicks, the CEO, that to get an organization like that off the ground of that size and scope of national prominence is very important. And even when the doors are open, it's important to tell people we have to support institutions like that to keep the mission alive and to keep it moving forward. You've got all sorts of other big museums in town, and they're great, but they raise millions of dollars a year. And so because that is what it takes. And those are the kind of things that are important. One of my more favorite boards I've been on lately is the Conservancy for the Parthenon at Centennial Park, which is the Friends group of Centennial Park. I am a very big expert on the Tennessee Centennial Exposition, which was the 1897 World's Fair that actually Booker T. Washington visited and spoke at. But the mission of the Parthenon is very long and interesting. We, a couple of years ago, had a symposium led by Dr. Phyllis Hildreth at American Baptist, where we had Kwame Lillard, Reverend Mitchell, myself, Howard Gentry, and we talked about the segregated swimming pool at Centennial Park that we owned up to kind of a not so nice part of Nashville history. Everyone talks about the lunch counter sit-ins on Fifth Avenue, now John Lewis Way. We talk about the bombings. We talk about in 1957, the Nashville 16 students that integrated the schools, but we don't really talk about what happened in our city segregated swimming pools that Howard Gentry and Kwame Lillard were trying to integrate. And when they went that day and tried to jump in the pool, they decided to close the pool. And the reaction of the city was to not only close that pool, but to close every single public pool in Nashville, which is why today you have all these kind of faux country club pool and tennis organizations like Seven Hills and Sequoia and all these others that popped up because the city closed down all the public pools. And so private organizations could open up neighborhood swimming pools and tennis centers. And that's exactly what happened. And so one of the great things about the Conservancy of the Parthenon is we're bringing new stories to light. We're talking about who was in that park and why, and also making it a park that's welcome and open for everybody. As we know, Hadley Park, which is now Hadley Lillard Park, is the first city African-American park in America. No other city had started a park just for African-Americans, and we were the first to do that in 1914. And so that was very important. And it's something that it's our great legacy. So I enjoyed being involved with that. And the other thing, the Nashville Public School Education Foundation just did a documentary on the history of, it's called By Design, the history of the public school system here in Nashville. And it was great to be involved in that project and interview some people and talk about kind of how things were. There's a screening coming up at the African American Museum. You can see it on their social media. I think it's August 17th. I would invite everyone to watch it or go to the Nashville Public Education Foundation and see other screenings in Nashville. But it tells the story of what happened here initially. And as the title implies, that by design early on, we created two separate school systems that were not equal, that were not equitable. And that's the conversation that we have today, particularly in the charitable giving community, that some people's giving has not been equitable. They gave to organizations that were West Nashville organizations, or that they were these prominent arts organizations, which I love, but they weren't at the same time also supporting some education organizations that help people of color or help educate people. Or you gave all your money to a Southeastern Conference school, but not a historically Black school, if you were a local bank or an insurance company or someone here in Nashville. And so equity is now kind of a lens that we all look through. And so this great documentary that Katie Kaur and her staff over there at the foundation did is kind of a must watch. And so as we learn from our history and celebrate what's good, we also need to kind of not repeat the same mistakes, and which is why it's good to kind of know that history and kind of see it and kind of say, okay, we're not going to do things exactly the way we were once did because it didn't include everybody.
Antonia, did you have a follow-up question? If not, just really quickly, I know you mentioned your mom and her impact as far as philanthropy. And there's also been some women, specifically, we talk about Ida B. Wells or Frankie Pierce in particular. So do you have, before you go into, kind of go into that, do you have any stories or highlights on how the women have impacted philanthropy? I know it sounds like your mom was sort of your initial teacher. And so any other women in particular, being, again, going back to equity and looking at how men and women have been in this fight together.
The Black women have always been very involved in things here in Nashville, and probably the one that has probably been the most involved from a business side and a philanthropy side that opened up the doors for all of us and that basically sat on all these boards when she was the only person in the room was Leatrice McKissick. Lee McKissick, who ran McKissick and McKissick for many, many years, and now her daughter Cheryl and Daryl run it. She served on boards like Cheekwood and all these arts organizations when they didn't have any other Black members. And this was as recent as the 80s and early 90s. And she not only saw it as her role to kind of be that voice, but to say to these people, kind of like Francis Guest and anybody that knew Francis Guest, that he would call people out in person and in private. And Leatrice was like that too, that she would say, well, how come you only have one Black person on your board? Or how come you're not bringing, African-American art displays here or doing more with this or that? And that's our role. So people like Leatrice, our landscape would be totally different if it weren't for her and Francis Guest. Those are the two giants that kind of opened up the door. And then on the political side, I think of Inez Crutchfield, that she was, I always called Inez the Black Jane Eskin, that, she was the one that really was involved with organizing and politics and everything like that. And Ellen, of course, is such a great legacy for the Eskin family and this community foundation. And I just think about where it started. It's like those Instagram memes. It's like where it started and how it's going. That picture for the community foundation is great. When you think about, we were a little late to the game to start one of these, but when we got started, we hit the ground running. And all the buildings and all the funds and all the impact that we have had on this city. So I think of someone like Inez, who, if you wanted to run for office or if you wanted to do anything in North Nashville, she was the first person you talked to, and you better get her support. And that's how Jane Eskin was too, that she was just this larger than life person who wielded influence, but wielded for good. And that's what our good leaders do. It's not for their personal self or their personal advancement, it's for the community. And those are the true leaders in the African-American community and the larger community. If they do things, but it's for the public good. I have a kind of informal, loose definition of, I think of a city father or city mother. And a city father or city mother does a big civic project that is not for their own personal benefit, but it's for the larger benefit. And it may be building a symphony hall or a museum or something that is just good for everybody. And those kind of acts are very important. And Nashvillians are very generous, but very selfless too, that we give our money and time, and it's just to help people for generations and generations and generations. These buildings and these funds with the community foundation will outlive us all, but that's legacy building. Legacy and wealth building. That's what the community foundation does every day.
I totally agree. Antonia, do you have a closing question before we thank our guests and sort of close out?
Well, really just kind of a closing question. It's funny watching some of the Olympics now, and they were one of some things last night, and they were talking about the passing of the baton. So what are some maybe final thoughts on all the legacy that we have here of passing the baton to not only the new generation, but the next generations coming after that?
Yeah, it's interesting, like a lot in the white community, the African-American community, Nashville's changed so rapidly that you had these old Black families the old guard. But now you've got people that come here for school. They weren't here 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and they're dominant and they're running things. We have our homegrown people too. And so it's not as apparent who the baton gets passed to, and it's not like royalty that just goes down to your kids. Sometimes it's just for somebody who's doing great things in the community, or a big entrepreneur that just showed up here that wants to get involved. I mean, it's people that step up. You don't wait for the baton to be passed to you. You step up and do it, and you earn your stripe. And that's, I think, the opportunity that we have, that a young Morehouse graduate can come to this city and then really just be involved, that didn't grow up here, didn't go to school here. And so that's the Nashville that we've created. And so don't wait around for anyone to hand you something or pass something off to you. Just grab it, go for it, and make this a better city.
I think that's an amazing way to sort of close out. And from that standpoint, David, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your feedback as well. You guys go to blackgivingback.com and take a look at some of the stories that are out there. Get involved. You know, David has given us a blueprint exactly of how to follow, how legacy needs to work. And so, you know, we look at the giants that have passed on, and also the ones that are still here. And, you know, we have a Changemaker series. I think over the next couple of weeks, you guys will see, for those of you who are following the Community Foundation page, you'll see our Changemaker series. And one of the other ladies that mentioned, Miss Rosetta Perry as well. So from that standpoint, so you'll see those. So all the different legacy of Changemakers. Also, we have a couple of new Changemakers as well. So make sure you subscribe to the Facebook channel or the Facebook page, and so that you actually get a chance to see all the Changemakers that we highlight, that we will continue to do throughout the year, but this month we're going to focus on specifically. So take a look at those. David, again, we don't know how much to thank you for taking your time. I know you're extremely busy. We want to be respectful of that time. And if you have anything else you want to share, we want to go with that. But really quickly, I want to sort of recognize the people who are behind the scenes. Audra Cox, who has been diligently sending us questions from you guys on the Facebook page. We're trying to get your questions in, but we'll make sure we answer those questions if you have anything in particular. Also, Kelly Wahlberg, who is the communications over at the Community Foundation specifically. I am Lisa Swift Young, and my husband Antonio Young are members of the Community Foundation, as well as the fund Change We Seek, which is a Black philanthropy fund specifically about financial literacy. So that fund is also listed on the community page. And so if you have interest in that, you can see those funds and all the other funds at the blackgivingback.com. So David, anything else in particular? If not, we want to basically say thank you. Our time is up for now, but again, subscribe or like the Facebook page for Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. You'll be able to see all of the alerts that are coming over the next couple of weeks about our Changemaker series, about different activities that we're going to have to highlight Black philanthropy. Next Thursday, we have one of the architects of the Black Philanthropy Global Initiative. And so if you don't want to miss that one, so make sure you go ahead and like the page so that you get that as well. So David, any parting thoughts?
Well, just thank you again, Lisa and Ellen and the whole staff of the Community Foundation. Audra, it's an honor to speak to the group. And like I said, I still think of Francis Guest when I think of the Community Foundation, my old friend and mentor. But if you don't know much about the Community Foundation, go to their website, look at the large reach that they have and all the funds and all the places that they are making a difference, sometimes publicly, sometimes very quietly in our city. Our city doesn't run by itself, and there needs to be a lot of help and money and just activism. And so if you've thought, I've been kind of cooped up this last year and a half, and I need to get out there and do more in the community, this organization and Give Black and Give Back is also a good thing to do.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Again, remember to like the page, follow us, and you will hear about more stories if you need to be inspired. You can start giving right now. So go to that. I think Kelly are just going to put something in the Facebook link as well. So other than that, we will see you guys really soon. We thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, David.
Mhm.